This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, Part 3, Chapter 5. So then, all was explained by the submarine explosion of this torpedo. Cyrus Harding could not be mistaken, as, during the War of the Union, he had had occasion to try these terrible engines of destruction. It was under the action of this cylinder, charged with some explosive substance, nitroglycerin, picrate, or some other material of the same nature, that the water of the channel had been raised like a dome, the bottom of the brig crushed in, and she had sunk instantly, the damage done to her hull being so considerable that it was impossible to refloat her. The Speedy had not been able to withstand a torpedo that would have destroyed an ironclad as easily as a fishing boat. Yes, all was explained, everything, except the presence of the torpedo in the waters of the channel. "My friends, then," said Cyrus Harding, "we can no longer be in doubt as to the presence of a mysterious being, a castaway like us, perhaps, abandoned on our island, and I say this in order that Ayrton may be acquainted with all the strange events which have occurred during these 2 years. Who this beneficent stranger is, whose intervention has, so fortunately for us, been manifested on many occasions, I cannot imagine. What his object can be in acting thus, in concealing himself after rendering us so many services, I cannot understand. But his services are not the less real, and are of such a nature that only a man possessed of prodigious power could render them. Ayrton is indebted to him as much as we are, for, if it was the stranger who saved me from the waves after the fall from the balloon, evidently it was he who wrote the document, who placed the bottle in the channel, and who has made known to us the situation of our companion. I will add that it was he who guided that chest, provided with everything we wanted, and stranded it on Flotsam Point, that it was he who lighted that fire on the heights of the island which permitted you to land, that it was he who fired that bullet found in the body of the peccary, that it was he who plunged that torpedo into the channel which destroyed the brig, in a word, that all those inexplicable events, for which we could not assign a reason, are due to this mysterious being. Therefore, whoever he may be, whether shipwrecked or exiled on our island, we shall be ungrateful if we think ourselves freed from gratitude towards him. We have contracted a debt, and I hope that we shall one day pay it." "You are right in speaking thus, my dear Cyrus," replied Gideon Spilett. "Yes, there is an almost all-powerful being, hidden in some part of the island, and whose influence has been singularly useful to our colony. I will add that the unknown appears to possess means of action which border on the supernatural, if in the events of practical life the supernatural were recognizable. Is it he who is in secret communication with us by the well in Granite House, and has he thus a knowledge of all our plans? Was it he who threw us that bottle when the vessel made her first cruise? Was it he who threw Top out of the lake and killed the dugong? Was it he who, as everything leads us to believe, saved you from the waves, and that under circumstances in which anyone else would not have been able to act? If it was he, he possesses a power which renders him master of the elements." The reporter's reasoning was just, and everyone felt it to be so. "Yes," rejoined Cyrus Harding, "if the intervention of a human being is not more questionable for us, I agree that he has at his disposal means of action beyond those possessed by humanity. There is a mystery still, but if we discover the man, the mystery will be discovered also. The question, then, is, ought we to respect the incognito of this generous being, or ought we to do everything to find him out? What is your opinion on the matter?" "My opinion," said Pencroft, "is that, whoever he may be, He is a brave man, and he has my esteem." "Be it so," answered Harding. "But that is not an answer, Pencroft." "Master," then said Neb, "my idea is, that we may search as long as we like for this gentleman whom you are talking about, but that we shall not discover him till he pleases." "That's not bad what you say, Neb," observed Pencroft. "I am of Neb's opinion," said Gideon Spilett, "but that is no reason for not attempting the adventure. Whether we find this mysterious being or not, we shall at least have fulfilled our duty towards him." "And you, my boy, give us your opinion," said the engineer, turning to Herbert. "Oh!" cried Herbert, his countenance full of animation. "How I should like to thank him! He who saved you first, and who has now saved us." "Of course, my boy," replied Pencroft. "So would I and all of us. I am not inquisitive, but I would give one of my eyes to see this individual face to face. It seems to me that he must be handsome, tall, strong, with a splendid beard, radiant hair, that he must be seated on clouds, a great ball in his hands." "But, Pencroft," answered Spilett, "you are describing a picture of the Creator." "Possibly, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor, "but that is how I imagine him." "And you, Ayrton?" asked the engineer. "Captain Harding," replied Ayrton, "I can give you no better advice in this matter. Whatever you do will be best. When you wish me to join you in your researches, I am ready to follow you." "I thank you, Ayrton," answered Cyrus Harding, "but I should like a more direct answer to the question I put to you. You are our companion. You have already endangered your life several times for us, and you, as well as the rest, ought to be consulted in the matter of any important decision. Speak, therefore." "Captain Harding," replied Ayrton, "I think that we ought to do everything to discover this unknown benefactor. Perhaps he is alone. Perhaps he is suffering. Perhaps he has a life to be renewed. I, too, as you said, have a debt of gratitude to pay him. It was he, it could be only he, who must have come to Tabor Island, who found there the wretch you knew, and who made known to you that there was an unfortunate man there to be saved. Therefore it is thanks to him that I have become a man again. No, I will never forget him." "That is settled, then," said Cyrus Harding. "We will begin our researches as soon as possible. We will not leave a corner of the island unexplored. We will search into its most secret recesses, and will hope that our unknown friend will pardon us in consideration of our intentions." For several days the colonists were actively employed in haymaking and the harvest. Before putting their project of exploring the yet unknown parts of the island into execution, they wished to get all possible work finished. It was also the time for collecting the various vegetables from the Tabor Island plants. All was stowed away, and happily there was no want of room in Granite House, in which they might have housed all the treasures of the island. The products of the colony were there, methodically arranged, and in a safe place, as may be believed, sheltered as much from animals as from man. There was no fear of damp in the middle of that thick mass of granite. Many natural excavations situated in the upper passage were enlarged either by pickaxe or mine, and Granite House thus became a general warehouse, containing all the provisions, arms, tools, and spare utensils, in a word, all the stores of the colony. As to the guns obtained from the brig, they were pretty pieces of ordnance, which, at Pencroft's entreaty, were hoisted by means of tackle and pulleys right up into Granite House. Embrasures were made between the windows, and the shining muzzles of the guns could soon be seen through the granite cliff. From this height they commanded all Union Bay. It was like a little Gibraltar, and any vessel anchored off the islet would inevitably be exposed to the fire of this aerial battery. "Captain," said Pencroft one day, it was the 8th of November, "now that our fortifications are finished, it would be a good thing if we tried the range of our guns." "Do you think that is useful?" asked the engineer. "It is more than useful. It is necessary. Without that, how are we to know to what distance we can send one of those pretty shot with which we are provided?" "Try them, Pencroft," replied the engineer. "However, I think that in making the experiment we ought to employ, not the ordinary powder, the supply of which, I think, should remain untouched, but the pyroxyle which will never fail us." "Can the cannon support the shock of the pyroxyle?" asked the reporter, who was not less anxious than Pencroft to try the artillery of Granite House. "I believe so. However," added the engineer, "we will be prudent." The engineer was right in thinking that the guns were of excellent make. Made of forged steel and breech-loaders, they ought consequently to be able to bear a considerable charge, and also have an enormous range. In fact, as regards practical effect, the transit described by the ball ought to be as extended as possible, and this tension could only be obtained under the condition that the projectile should be impelled with a very great initial velocity. "Now," said Harding to his companions, "the initial velocity is in proportion to the quantity of powder used. In the fabrication of these pieces, everything depends on employing a metal with the highest possible power of resistance, and steel is incontestably that metal of all others which resists the best. I have, therefore, reason to believe that our guns will bear without risk the expansion of the pyroxyle gas, and will give excellent results." "We shall be a great deal more certain of that when we have tried them," answered Pencroft. It is unnecessary to say that the 4 cannons were in perfect order. Since they had been taken from the water, the sailor had bestowed great care upon them. How many hours he had spent in rubbing, greasing, and polishing them, and in cleaning the mechanism! And now the pieces were as brilliant as if they had been on board a frigate of the United States Navy. On this day, therefore, in presence of all the members of the colony, including Master Jup and Top, the 4 cannon were successively tried. They were charged with pyroxyle, taking into consideration its explosive power, which, as has been said, is 4 times that of ordinary powder. The projectile to be fired was cylindro-conic. Pencroft, holding the end of the quick match, stood ready to fire. At Harding's signal, he fired. The shot, passing over the islet, fell into the sea at a distance which could not be calculated with exactitude. The second gun was pointed at the rocks at the end of Flotsam Point, and the shot, striking a sharp rock nearly 3 miles from Granite House, made it fly into splinters. It was Herbert who had pointed this gun and fired it, and very proud he was of his first shot. Pencroft only was prouder than he. Such a shot, the honor of which belonged to his dear boy. The third shot, aimed this time at the downs forming the upper side of Union Bay, struck the sand at a distance of 4 miles, then, having ricocheted, was lost in the sea in a cloud of spray. For the 4th piece, Cyrus Harding slightly increased the charge, so as to try its extreme range. Then, all standing aside for fear of its bursting, the match was lighted by means of a long cord. A tremendous report was heard, but the piece had held good, and the colonists, rushing to the windows, saw the shot graze the rocks of Mandible Cape, nearly 5 miles from Granite House, and disappear in Shark Gulf. "Well, Captain," exclaimed Pencroft, whose cheers might have rivaled the reports themselves, "what do you say of our battery? All the pirates in the Pacific have only to present themselves before Granite House. Not one can land there now without our permission." "Believe me, Pencroft," replied the engineer, "it would be better not to have to make the experiment." "Well," said the sailor, "what ought to be done with regard to those 6 villains who are roaming about the island? Are we to leave them to overrun our forests, our fields, our plantations? These pirates are regular jaguars, and it seems to me we ought not to hesitate to treat them as such. What do you think, Ayrton?" added Pencroft, turning to his companion. Ayrton hesitated at first to reply, and Cyrus Harding regretted that Pencroft had so thoughtlessly put this question. and he was much moved when Ayrton replied in a humble tone, "I have been one of those jaguars, Mr. Pencroft. I have no right to speak." And with a slow step he walked away. Pencroft understood. "What a brute I am!" he exclaimed. "Poor Ayrton! He has as much right to speak here as anyone." "Yes," said Gideon Spilett, "but his reserve does him honor, and it is right to respect the feeling which he has about his sad past." "Certainly, Mr. Spilett," answered the sailor, "and there is no fear of my doing so again. I would rather bite my tongue off than cause Ayrton any pain. But, to return to the question, it seems to me that these ruffians have no right to any pity, and that we ought to rid the island of them as soon as possible." "Is that your opinion, Pencroft?" asked the engineer. "Quite my opinion." "And before hunting them mercilessly, you would not wait until they had committed some fresh act of hostility against us?" "Isn't what they have done already enough?" asked Pencroft, who did not understand these scruples. "They may adopt other sentiments," said Harding, "and perhaps repent." "They repent!" exclaimed the sailor, shrugging his shoulders.
"Pencroft, think of Ayrton," said Herbert, taking the sailor's hand. "He became an honest man again."
Pencroft looked at his companions one after the other. He had never thought of his proposal being met with any objection. His rough nature could not allow that they ought to come to terms with the rascals who had landed on the island, with Bob Harvey's accomplices, the murderers of the crew of the Speedy, and he looked upon them as wild beasts which ought to be destroyed without delay and without remorse. "Come," said he, "everybody is against me. You wish to be generous to those villains. Very well, I hope we mayn't repent it."
"What danger shall we run," said Herbert, "if we take care to be always on our guard?"
Observed the reporter, who had not given any decided opinion. "They are 6 and well armed. If they each lay hid in a corner, and each fired at one of us, they would soon be masters of the colony."
"Why have they not done so?" said Herbert. "No doubt because it was not their interest to do it. Besides, we are 6 also."
"Well, well," replied Pencroft, whom no reasoning could have convinced. "Let us leave these good people to do what they like, and don't think anything more about them." "Come, Pencroft," said Neb, "don't make yourself out so bad as all that. Suppose one of these unfortunate men were here before you, within good range of your gun, you would not fire." "I would fire on him as I would on a mad dog, Neb," replied Pencroft coldly. "Pencroft," said the engineer, "you have always shown much deference to my advice. Will you, in this matter, yield to me?" "I will do as you please, Captain Harding," answered the sailor, who was not at all convinced. "Very well. Wait, and we will not attack them unless we are attacked first." Thus their behavior towards the pirates was agreed upon, although Pencroft augured nothing good from it. They were not to attack them, but were to be on their guard. After all, the island was large and fertile. If any sentiment of honesty yet remained in the bottom of their hearts, these wretches might perhaps be reclaimed. Was it not their interest in the situation in which they found themselves to begin a new life? At any rate, for humanity's sake alone, it would be right to wait. The colonists would no longer as before be able to go and come without fear. Hitherto they had only wild beasts to guard against, and now 6 convicts of the worst description, perhaps, were roaming over their island. It was serious, certainly, and to less brave men it would have been security lost. No matter. At present the colonists had reason on their side against Pencroft. Would they be right in the future? That remained to be seen. End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, Part 3, Chapter 6. However, The chief business of the colonists was to make that complete exploration of the island which had been decided upon, and which would have two objects: to discover the mysterious being whose existence was now indisputable, and at the same time to find out what had become of the pirates, what retreat they had chosen, what sort of life they were leading, and what was to be feared from them. Cyrus Harding wished to set out without delay, but as the expedition would be of some days' duration, it appeared best to load the cart with different materials and tools in order to facilitate the organization of the encampments. One of the onagers, however, having hurt its leg, could not be harnessed at present, and a few days' rest was necessary. The departure was, therefore, put off for a week, until the 20th of November. The month of November in this latitude corresponds to the month of May in the northern zones. It was, therefore, the fine season. The sun was entering the Tropic of Capricorn, and gave the longest days in the year. The time was, therefore, very favorable for the projected expedition, which, if it did not accomplish its principal object, would at any rate be fruitful in discoveries, especially of natural productions, since Harding proposed to explore those dense forests of the far west, which stretched to the extremity of the Serpentine Peninsula. During the 9 days which preceded their departure, it was agreed that the work on Prospect Heights should be finished off. Moreover, it was necessary for Ayrton to return to the corral, where the domesticated animals required his care. It was decided that he should spend 2 days there, and return to Granite House after having liberally supplied the stables. As he was about to start, Harding asked him if he would not like one of them to accompany him, observing that the island was less safe than formerly. Ayrton replied that this was unnecessary, as he was enough for the work, and that besides he apprehended no danger. If anything occurred at the corral or in the neighborhood, he could instantly warn the colonists by sending a telegram to Granite House. Ayrton departed at dawn on the 9th, taking the cart drawn by one onager, and 2 hours after, the electric wire announced that he had found all in order at the corral. During these 2 days Harding busied himself in executing a project which would completely guard Granite House against any surprise. It was necessary to completely conceal the opening of the old outlet, which was already walled up and partly hidden under grass and plants, at the southern angle of Lake Grant. Nothing was easier, since if the level of the lake was raised 2 or 3 feet, the opening would be quite beneath it. Now, to raise this level they had only to establish a dam at the 2 openings made by the lake, and by which were fed Creek Glycerine and Falls River. The colonists worked with a will, and the 2 dams, which besides did not exceed 8 feet in width by 3 in height, were rapidly erected by means of well-cemented blocks of stone. This work finished, it would have been impossible to guess that at that part of the lake there existed a subterranean passage through which the overflow of the lake formerly escaped. Of course, the little stream which fed the reservoir of Granite House and worked the lift had been carefully preserved, and the water could not fail. The lift once raised, this sure and comfortable retreat would be safe from any surprise. This work had been so quickly done that Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert found time to make an expedition to Port Balloon. The sailor was very anxious to know if the little creek in which the Bonadventure was moored had been visited by the convicts. "Those gentlemen," he observed, "landed on the south coast, and if they followed the shore, it is to be feared that they may have discovered the little harbor, and in that case I wouldn't give $50 for our Bonadventure." Pencroft's apprehensions were not without foundation, and a visit to Port Balloon appeared to be very desirable. The sailor and his companions set off on the 10th of November, after dinner, well armed. Pencroft, ostentatiously slipping 2 bullets into each barrel of his rifle, shook his head in a way which betokened nothing good to any one who approached too near him, whether man or beast, as he said. Gideon Spilett and Herbert also took their guns, and about 3 o'clock all three left Granite House. Neb accompanied them to the turn of the Mersey, and after they had crossed, he raised the bridge. It was agreed that a gunshot should announce the colonists' return, and that at the signal Neb should return and re-establish the communication between the two banks of the river. The little band advanced directly along the road which led to the southern coast of the island. This was only a distance of 3 miles and a half, but Gideon Spilett and his companions took 2 hours to traverse it. They examined all the border of the road, the thick forest, as well as Tabor Marsh. They found no trace of the fugitives, who, no doubt, not having yet discovered the number of the colonists, or the means of defense which they had at their disposal, had gained the less accessible parts of the island. Arrived at Port Balloon, Pencroft saw with extreme satisfaction that the Bonadventure was tranquilly floating in the narrow creek. However, Port Balloon was so well hidden among high rocks that it could scarcely be discovered either from the land or the sea. "Come," said Pencroft, "the blackguards have not been there yet. Long grass suits reptiles best, and evidently we shall find them in the far west."
"And it's very lucky, for if they had found the Bonadventure," added Herbert, "they would have gone off in her, and we should have been prevented from returning to Tabor Island."
"Indeed," remarked the reporter, "it will be important to take a document there which will make known the situation of Lincoln Island, and Ayrton's new residence, in case the Scotch yacht returns to fetch him." "Well, the Bonadventure is always there, Mr. Spilett," answered the sailor. "She and her crew are ready to start at a moment's notice." "I think, Pencroft, that is a thing to be done after our exploration of the island is finished. It is possible, after all, that the stranger, if we manage to find him, may know as much about Tabor Island as about Lincoln Island. Do not forget that he is certainly the author of the document, and he may, perhaps, know how far we may count on the return of the yacht."
"But," exclaimed Pencroft, "who in the world can he be? The fellow knows us, and we know nothing about him. If he is a simple castaway, why should he conceal himself? We are honest men, I suppose, and the society of honest men isn't unpleasant to anyone. Did he come here voluntarily? Can he leave the island if he likes? Is he here still? Will he remain any longer?" Chatting thus, Pencroft, Gideon Spilett, and Herbert got on board and looked about the deck of the Bonadventure. All at once, the sailor having examined the bits to which the cable of the anchor were secured, "Hallo!" he cried, "this is queer."
"What is the matter, Pencroft?" asked the reporter.
"The matter is that it was not I who made this knot." And Pencroft showed a rope which fastened the cable to the bit itself.
"What? It was not you?" asked Gideon Spilett.
"No, I can swear to it. This is a reef knot, and I always make a running bowline."
"You must be mistaken, Pencroft."
"I am not mistaken," declared the sailor. "My hand does it so naturally, and one's hand is never mistaken." "How can the convicts have been on board?" asked Herbert. "I know nothing about that," answered Pencroft. "But what is certain is that someone has weighed the Bonadventure's anchor and dropped it again. And look here, here is another proof. The cable of the anchor has been run out, and its service is no longer at the hawse hole. I repeat that someone has been using our vessel."
"But if the convicts had used her, they would have pillaged her, or rather gone off with her."
"Gone off? Where to? To Tabor Island?" replied Pencroft. "Do you think they would risk themselves in a boat of such small tonnage?"
"We must besides be sure that they know of the islet," rejoined the reporter.
"However that may be," said the sailor, "as sure as my name is Bonadventure Pencroft of the Vineyard, our Bonadventure has sailed without us." The sailor was so positive that neither Gideon Spilett nor Herbert could dispute his statement. It was evident that the vessel had been moved, more or less, since Pencroft had brought her to Port Balloon. As to the sailor, he had not the slightest doubt that the anchor had been raised and then dropped again. Now, what was the use of these two maneuvers unless the vessel had been employed in some expedition?
"But how was it we did not see the Bonadventure pass in sight of the island?" observed the reporter, who was anxious to bring forward every possible objection.
"Why, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor, "they would only have to start in the night with a good breeze, and they would be out of sight of the island in 2 hours."
"Well," resumed Gideon Spilett, "I ask again, what object could the convicts have had in using the Bonadventure, and why, after they had made use of her, should they have brought her back to port?"
"Why, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor, "we must put that among the unaccountable things, and not think anything more about it. The chief thing is that the Bonadventure was there, and she is there now. Only, unfortunately, if the convicts take her a second time, we shall very likely not find her again in her place." "Then, Pencroft," said Herbert, "would it not be wisest to bring the Bonadventure off to Granite House?"
"Yes and no," answered Pencroft. "Or rather, no. The mouth of the Mercy is a bad place for a vessel, and the sea is heavy there."
"But by hauling her up on the sand, to the foot of the Chimneys?"
"Perhaps yes," replied Pencroft. "At any rate, since we must leave Granite House for a long expedition, I think the Bonadventure will be safer here during our absence, and we shall do best to leave her here until the island is rid of those blackguards." "That is exactly my opinion," said the reporter. "At any rate, in the event of bad weather, she will not be exposed here as she would be at the mouth of the Mercy."
"But suppose the convicts pay her another visit?" said Herbert.
"Well, my boy," replied Pencroft, "not finding her here, they would not be long in finding her on the sands of Granite House, and during our absence nothing could hinder them from seizing her. I agree, therefore, with Mr. Spilett, that she must be left in Port Balloon. But if on our return we have not rid the island of those rascals, it will be prudent to bring our boat to Granite House, until the time when we need not fear any unpleasant visits." "That's settled. Let us be off," said the reporter.
Pencroft, Herbert, and Gideon Spilett, on their return to Granite House, told the engineer all that had passed, and the latter approved of their arrangements both for the present and the future. He also promised the sailor that he would study that part of the channel situated between the islet and the coast, so as to ascertain if it would not be possible to make an artificial harbor there by means of dams. In this way the Bonadventure would be always within reach, under the eyes of the colonists, and if necessary, under lock and key. That evening a telegram was sent to Ayrton, requesting him to bring from the corral a couple of goats, which Neb wished to acclimatize to the plateau. Singularly enough, Ayrton did not acknowledge the receipt of the dispatch, as he was accustomed to do. That could not but astonish the engineer. But it might be that Ayrton was not at that moment in the corral, or even that he was on his way back to Granite House. In fact, 2 days had already passed since his departure, and it had been decided that on the evening of the 10th, or at the latest the morning of the 11th, he should return. The colonists waited, therefore, for Ayrton to appear on Prospect Heights. Neb and Herbert even watched at the bridge, so as to be ready to lower it the moment their companion presented himself. But up to 10 in the evening there were no signs of Ayrton. It was, therefore, judged best to send a fresh dispatch, requiring an immediate reply. The bell of the telegraph at Granite House remained mute. The colonists' uneasiness was great. What had happened? Was Ayrton no longer at the corral? Or if he was still there, had he no longer control over his movements? Could they go to the corral in this dark night? They consulted. Some wished to go, the others to remain. "But," said Herbert, "perhaps some accident has happened to the telegraphic apparatus, so that it works no longer?"
"That may be," said the reporter.
"Wait till tomorrow," replied Cyrus Harding. "It is possible, indeed, that Ayrton has not received our dispatch, or even that we have not received his." They waited, of course not without some anxiety. At dawn of day, the 11th of November, Harding again sent the electric current along the wire, and received no reply. He tried again. The same result. "Off to the corral," said he. "And well armed," added Pencroft. It was immediately decided that Granite House should not be left alone, and that Neb should remain there. After having accompanied his friends to Creek Glycerine, he raised the bridge, and, waiting behind a tree, he watched for the return of either his companions or Ayrton. In the event of the pirates presenting themselves and attempting to force the passage, he was to endeavor to stop them by firing on them, and as a last resource he was to take refuge in Granite House, where, the lift once raised, he would be in safety. Cyrus Harding, Gideon Spilett, Herbert, and Pencroft were to repair to the corral, and if they did not find Ayrton, search the neighboring woods. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the engineer and his 3 companions had passed Creek Glycerine, and Neb posted himself behind a small mound crowned by several dragon trees on the left bank of the stream. The colonists, after leaving the plateau of Prospect Heights, immediately took the road to the corral. They shouldered their guns, ready to fire on the slightest hostile demonstration. The 2 rifles and the 2 guns had been loaded with ball. The wood was thick on each side of the road, and might easily have concealed the convicts, who, owing to their weapons, would have been really formidable. The colonists walked rapidly and in silence. Top preceded them, sometimes running on the road, sometimes taking a ramble into the wood, but always quiet and not appearing to fear anything unusual. And they could be sure that the faithful dog would not allow them to be surprised, but would bark at the least appearance of danger. Cyrus Harding and his companions followed beside the road the wire which connected the corral with Granite House. After walking for nearly 2 miles, they had not, as yet, discovered any explanation of the difficulty. The posts were in good order, the wire regularly extended. However, at that moment, the engineer observed that the wire appeared to be slack, and on arriving at post number 74, Herbert, who was in advance, stopped, exclaiming, "The wire is broken!" His companions hurried forward, and arrived at the spot where the lad was standing. The post was rooted up and lying across the path. The unexpected explanation of the difficulty was here, and it was evident that the dispatches from Granite House had not been received at the corral, nor those from the corral at Granite House. "It wasn't the wind that blew down this post," observed Pencroft. "No," replied Gideon Spilett. "The earth has been dug up round its foot, and it has been torn up by the hand of man." "Besides, the wire is broken," added Herbert, showing that the wire had been snapped. "Is the fracture recent?" asked Harding.
"Yes," answered Herbert. "It has certainly been done quite lately."
"To the corral! To the corral!" exclaimed the sailor. The colonists were now halfway between Granite House and the corral, having still 2 miles and a half to go. They pressed forward with redoubled speed. Indeed, it was to be feared that some serious accident had occurred in the corral. No doubt, Ayrton might have sent a telegram which had not arrived, but this was not the reason why his companions were so uneasy, for, a more unaccountable circumstance, Ayrton, who had promised to return the evening before, had not reappeared. In short, it was not without a motive that all communications had been stopped between the corral and Granite House, and who but the convicts could have any interest in interrupting this communication? The settlers hastened on, their hearts oppressed with anxiety. They were sincerely attached to their new companion. Were they to find him struck down by the hands of those of whom he was formerly the leader? Soon they arrived at the place where the road led along the side of the little stream which flowed from the Red Creek and watered the meadows of the corral. They then moderated their pace so that they should not be out of breath at the moment when a struggle might be necessary. Their guns were in their hands ready cocked. The forest was watched on every side. Top uttered sullen groans which were rather ominous. At last the palisade appeared through the trees. No trace of any damage could be seen. The gate was shut as usual. Deep silence reigned in the corral. Neither the accustomed bleating of the sheep nor Ayrton's voice could be heard. "Let us enter," said Cyrus Harding. And the engineer advanced, while his companions, keeping watch about 20 paces behind him, were ready to fire at a moment's notice. Harding raised the inner latch of the gate, and was about to push it back, when Top barked loudly. A report sounded, and was responded to by a cry of pain. Herbert, struck by a bullet, lay stretched on the ground. End of chapter.
The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, Part 3, Chapter 7. At Herbert's cry, Pencroft, letting his gun fall, rushed towards him. "They have killed him!" he cried. "My boy, they have killed him!" Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett ran to Herbert. The reporter listened to ascertain if the poor lad's heart was still beating. "He lives," said he, "but he must be carried to Granite House? That is impossible," replied the engineer. "Into the corral, then," said Pencroft. "In a moment," said Harding. And he ran round the left corner of the palisade. There he found a convict, who, aiming at him, sent a ball through his hat. In a few seconds, before he had even time to fire his second barrel, he fell, struck to the heart by Harding's dagger, more sure even than his gun. During this time, Gideon Spilett and the sailor hoisted themselves over the palisade, leaped into the enclosure, threw down the props which supported the inner door, ran into the empty house, and soon poor Herbert was lying on Ayrton's bed. In a few moments Harding was by his side. On seeing Herbert senseless, the sailor's grief was terrible. He sobbed, he cried, he tried to beat his head against the wall. Neither the engineer nor the reporter could calm him. They themselves were choked with emotion. They could not speak. However, they knew that it depended on them to rescue from death the poor boy who was suffering beneath their eyes. Gideon Spilett had not passed through the many incidents by which his life had been checkered without acquiring some slight knowledge of medicine. He knew a little of everything, and several times he had been obliged to attend to wounds produced either by a sword, bayonet, or shot. Assisted by Cyrus Harding, he proceeded to render the aid Herbert required. The reporter was immediately struck by the complete stupor in which Herbert lay, a stupor owing either to the hemorrhage or to the shock, the ball having struck a bone with sufficient force to produce a violent concussion. Herbert was deadly pale, and his pulse so feeble that Spilett only felt it beat at long intervals, as if it was on the point of stopping. These symptoms were very serious. Herbert's chest was laid bare, and the blood having been stanched with handkerchiefs, it was bathed with cold water. The contusion, or rather the contused wound, appeared, an oval below the chest between the third and fourth ribs. It was there that Herbert had been hit by the bullet. Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett then turned the poor boy over. As they did so, he uttered a moan so feeble that they almost thought it was his last sigh. Herbert's back was covered with blood from another contused wound, by which the ball had immediately escaped. "God be praised," said the reporter. "The ball is not in the body, and we shall not have to extract it." "But the heart?" asked Harding. "The heart has not been touched. If it had been, Herbert would be dead." "Dead!" exclaimed Pencroft with a groan. The sailor had only heard the last words uttered by the reporter. "No, Pencroft," replied Cyrus Harding. "No, he is not dead. His pulse still beats. He has even uttered a moan. But for your boy's sake, calm yourself. We have need of all our self-possession. Do not make us lose it, my friend." Pencroft was silent, but a reaction set in, and great tears rolled down his cheeks. In the meanwhile, Gideon Spilett endeavored to collect his ideas and proceed methodically. After his examination, he had no doubt that the ball, entering in front,
between the 7th and 8th ribs, had issued behind between the 3rd and 4th. But what mischief had the ball committed in its passage? What important organs had been reached? A professional surgeon would have had difficulty in determining this at once, and still more so the reporter. However, he knew one thing. This was that he would have to prevent the inflammatory strangulation of the injured parts, then to contend with the local inflammation and fever which would result from the wound, perhaps mortal. Now, what styptics, what antiphlogistics ought to be employed? By what means could inflammation be prevented? At any rate, the most important thing was that the 2 wounds should be dressed without delay. It did not appear necessary to Gideon Spilett that a fresh flow of blood should be caused by bathing them in tepid water and compressing their lips. The hemorrhage had been very abundant, and Herbert was already too much enfeebled by the loss of blood. The reporter therefore thought it best to simply bathe the 2 wounds with cold water. Herbert was placed on his left side, and was maintained in that position. "He must not be moved," said Gideon Spilett. "He is in the most favorable position for the wounds in his back and chest to suppurate easily, and absolute rest is necessary." "What? Can't we carry him to Granite House?" asked Pencroft. "No, Pencroft," replied the reporter. "I'll pay the villains off!" cried the sailor, shaking his fist in a menacing manner. "Pencroft," said Cyrus Harding. Gideon Spilett had resumed his examination of the wounded boy. Herbert was still so frightfully pale that the reporter felt anxious. "Cyrus," said he, "I am not a surgeon. I am in terrible perplexity. You must aid me with your advice, your experience." "Take courage, my friend," answered the engineer, pressing the reporter's hand. "Judge coolly. Think only of this. Herbert must be saved." These words restored in Gideon Spilett that self-possession which he had lost in a moment of discouragement on feeling his great responsibility. He seated himself close to the bed. Cyrus Harding stood near. Pencroft had torn up his shirt and was mechanically making lint. Spilett then explained to Cyrus Harding that he thought he ought first of all to stop the hemorrhage, but not close the 2 wounds or cause their immediate cicatrization, for there had been internal perforation, and the suppuration must not be allowed to accumulate in the chest. Harding approved entirely, and it was decided that the 2 wounds should be dressed without attempting to close them by immediate coaptation. And now did the colonists possess an efficacious agent to act against the inflammation which might occur? Yes, they had one, for nature had generously lavished it. They had cold water, that is to say, the most powerful sedative that can be employed against inflammation of wounds, the most efficacious therapeutic agent in grave cases, and the one which is now adopted by all physicians. Cold water has, moreover, the advantage of leaving the wound in absolute rest, and preserving it from all premature dressing, a considerable advantage, since it has been found by experience that contact with the air is dangerous during the first days. Gideon Spilett and Cyrus Harding reasoned thus with their simple good sense, and they acted as the best surgeon would have done. Compresses of linen were applied to poor Herbert's 2 wounds, and were kept constantly wet with cold water. The sailor had at first lighted a fire in the hut, which was not wanting in things necessary for life. Maple sugar, medicinal plants, the same which the lad had gathered on the banks of Lake Grant, enabled them to make some refreshing drinks, which they gave him without his taking any notice of it. His fever was extremely high, and all that day and night passed without his becoming conscious. Herbert's life hung on a thread, and this thread might break at any moment. The next day, the 12th of November, the hopes of Harding and his companions slightly revived. Herbert had come out of his long stupor. He opened his eyes. He recognized Cyrus Harding, the reporter, and Pencroft. He uttered 2 or 3 words. He did not know what had happened. They told him, and Spilett begged him to remain perfectly still, telling him that his life was not in danger, and that his wounds would heal in a few days. However, Herbert scarcely suffered at all, and the cold water with which they were continually bathed prevented any inflammation of the wounds. The suppuration was established in a regular way, the fever did not increase, and it might now be hoped that this terrible wound would not involve any catastrophe. Pencroft felt the swelling of his heart gradually subside. He was like a sister of mercy, like a mother by the bed of her child. Herbert dozed again, but his sleep appeared more natural. "Tell me again that you hope, Mr. Spilett," said Pencroft. "Tell me again that you will save Herbert." "Yes, we will save him," replied the reporter. "The wound is serious, and perhaps even the ball has traversed the lungs, but the perforation of this organ is not fatal." "God bless you," answered Pencroft. As may be believed, during the 24 hours they had been in the corral, the colonists had no other thought than that of nursing Herbert. They did not think either of the danger which threatened them should the convicts return, or of the precautions to be taken for the future. But on this day, while Pencroft watched by the sick bed, Cyrus Harding and the reporter consulted as to what it would be best to do. First of all, they examined the corral. There was not a trace of Ayrton. Had the unhappy man been dragged away by his former accomplices? Had he resisted and been overcome in the struggle? This last supposition was only too probable. Gideon Spilett, at the moment he scaled the palisade, had clearly seen some one of the convicts running along the southern spur of Mount Franklin, towards whom Top had sprung. It was one of those whose object had been so completely defeated by the rocks at the mouth of the Mercy. Besides, the one killed by Harding, and whose body was found outside the enclosure, of course belonged to Bob Harvey's crew. As to the corral, it had not suffered any damage. The gates were closed, and the animals had not been able to disperse in the forest. Nor could they see traces of any struggle, any devastation, either in the hut or in the palisade. The ammunition only, with which Ayrton had been supplied, had disappeared with him. "The unhappy man has been surprised," said Harding, "and as he was a man to defend himself, he must have been overpowered." "Yes, that is to be feared," said the reporter. "Then, doubtless, the convicts installed themselves in the corral, where they found plenty of everything, and only fled when they saw us coming. It is very evident, too, that at this moment Ayrton, whether living or dead, is not here." "We shall have to beat the forest," said the engineer, "and rid the island of these wretches." Pencroft's presentiments were not mistaken, when he wished to hunt them as wild beasts. That would have spared us all these misfortunes. "Yes," answered the reporter, "but now we have the right to be merciless." "At any rate," said the engineer, "we are obliged to wait some time, and to remain at the corral until we can carry Herbert without danger to Granite House." "But Neb?" asked the reporter. "Neb is in safety." "But if, uneasy at our absence, he should venture to come?" "He must not come," returned Cyrus Harding quickly. "He would be murdered on the road." "It is very probable, however, that he will attempt to rejoin us." "Ah, if the telegraph still acted, he might be warned. But that is impossible now. As to leaving Pencroft and Herbert here alone, we could not do it." "Well, I will go alone to Granite House." "No, no, Cyrus," answered the reporter. "You must not expose yourself. Your courage would be of no avail. The villains are evidently watching the corral. They are hidden in the thick woods which surround it. And if you go, we shall soon have to regret 2 misfortunes instead of 1. "But Neb," repeated the engineer. "It is now 24 hours since he has had any news of us. He will be sure to come." "And as he will be less on his guard than we should be ourselves," added Spilett,
He will be killed. Is there really no way of warning him? While the engineer thought, his eyes fell on Top, who, going backwards and forwards, seemed to say, "Am I not here?" "Top!" exclaimed Cyrus Harding. The animal sprang at his master's call. "Yes, Top will go," said the reporter, who had understood the engineer. "Top can go where we cannot. He will carry to Granite House the news of the corral, and he will bring back to us that from Granite House." "Top can go where we cannot. He will carry to Granite House the news of the corral, and he will bring back to us that from Granite House." "Quick!" said Harding. "Quick!" Spilett rapidly tore a leaf from his notebook, and wrote these words: "Herbert wounded. We are at the corral. Be on your guard. Do not leave Granite House. Have the convicts appeared in the neighborhood? Reply by Top." This laconic note contained all that Neb ought to know, and at the same time asked all that the colonist wished to know. It was folded and fastened to Top's collar in a conspicuous position. "Top, my dog," said the engineer, caressing the animal. "Neb, Top. Neb! Go! Go!" Top bounded at these words. He understood. He knew what was expected of him. The road to the corral was familiar to him. In less than an hour he could clear it, and it might be hoped that where neither Cyrus Harding nor the reporter could have ventured without danger, Top, running among the grass or in the wood, would pass unperceived. The engineer went to the gate of the corral and opened it. "Neb, Top, Neb!" repeated the engineer, again pointing in the direction of Granite House. Top sprang forwards, and almost immediately disappeared. "He will get there," said the reporter. "Yes, and he will come back, the faithful animal." "What o'clock is it?" asked Gideon Spilett. 10. "In an hour he may be here. We will watch for his return." The gate of the corral was closed. The engineer and the reporter re-entered the house. Herbert was still in a sleep. Pencroft kept the compresses always wet. Spilett, seeing that there was nothing he could do at that moment, busied himself in preparing some nourishment, while attentively watching that part of the enclosure against the hill at which an attack might be expected. The settlers awaited Top's return with much anxiety. A little before 11 o'clock, Cyrus Harding and the reporter, rifle in hand, were behind the gate, ready to open it at the first bark of their dog. They did not doubt that if Top had arrived safely at Granite House, Neb would have sent him back immediately. They had both been there for about 10 minutes, when a report was heard, followed by repeated barks. The engineer opened the gate, and seeing smoke 100 feet off in the wood, he fired in that direction. Almost immediately Top bounded into the corral, and the gate was quickly shut. "Top! Top!" exclaimed the engineer, taking the dog's great honest head between his hands. A note was fastened to his neck, and Cyrus Harding read these words, traced in Neb's large writing: "No pirates in the neighborhood of Granite House. I will not stir. Poor Mr. Herbert." End of chapter. The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. Part 3, Chapter 8. So the convicts were still there, watching the corral, and determined to kill the settlers one after the other. There was nothing to be done but to treat them as wild beasts. But great precautions must be taken, for just now the wretches had the advantage on their side, seeing and not being seen, being able to surprise by the suddenness of their attack, yet not to be surprised themselves. Harding made arrangements, therefore, for living in the corral, of which the provisions would last for a tolerable length of time. Ayrton's house had been provided with all that was necessary for existence, and the convicts, scared by the arrival of the settlers, had not had time to pillage it. It was probable, as Gideon Spilett observed, that things had occurred as follows. The 6 convicts, disembarking on the island, had followed the southern shore, and after having traversed the double shore of the Serpentine Peninsula,
Not being inclined to venture into the far west woods, they had reached the mouth of Falls River. From this point, by following the right bank of the watercourse, they would arrive at the spurs of Mount Franklin, among which they would naturally seek a retreat, and they could not have been long in discovering the corral, then uninhabited. There they had regularly installed themselves, awaiting the moment to put their abominable schemes into execution. Ayrton's arrival had surprised them, but they had managed to overpower the unfortunate man, and the rest may be easily imagined. Now the convicts, reduced to 5, it is true, but well armed, were roaming the woods, and to venture there was to expose themselves to their attacks, which could be neither guarded against nor prevented. "Wait, there is nothing else to be done," repeated Cyrus Harding. "When Herbert is cured, we can organize a general battue of the island, and have satisfaction of these convicts. That will be the object of our grand expedition at the same time." "As the search for our mysterious protector," added Gideon Spilett, finishing the engineer's sentence. "Ah, it must be acknowledged, my dear Cyrus, that this time his protection was wanting at the very moment when it was most necessary to us." "Who knows?" replied the engineer. "What do you mean?" asked the reporter. "That we are not at the end of our trouble yet, my dear Spilett, and that his powerful intervention may have another opportunity of exercising itself. But that is not the question now. Herbert's life before everything." That was the colonists' saddest thought. Several days passed, and the poor boy's state was happily no worse. Cold water, always kept at a suitable temperature, had completely prevented the inflammation of the wounds. It even seemed to the reporter that this water, being slightly sulphurous, which was explained by the neighborhood of the volcano, had a more direct action on the healing. The suppuration was much less abundant, and, thanks to the incessant care by which he was surrounded, Herbert returned to life, and his fever abated. He was, besides, subjected to a severe diet, and consequently his weakness was and would be extreme. But there was no want of refreshing drinks, and absolute rest was of the greatest benefit to him. Cyrus Harding, Gideon Spilett, and Pencroft had become very skilful in dressing the lad's wounds. All the linen in the house had been sacrificed. Herbert's wounds, covered with compresses and lint, were pressed neither too much nor too little, so as to cause their cicatrization without effecting any inflammatory reaction. The reporter used extreme care in the dressing, knowing well the importance of it, and repeating to his companions that which most surgeons willingly admit, that it is perhaps rarer to see a dressing well done than an operation well performed. In 10 days, on the 22nd of November, Herbert was considerably better. He had begun to take some nourishment. The color was returning to his cheeks, and his bright eyes smiled at his nurses. He talked a little, notwithstanding Pencroft's efforts, who talked incessantly to prevent him from beginning to speak, and told him the most improbable stories. Herbert had questioned him on the subject of Ayrton, whom he was astonished not to see near him, thinking that he was at the corral. But the sailor, not wishing to distress Herbert, contented himself by replying that Ayrton had rejoined Neb, so as to defend Granite House. "Humph!" said Pencroft. "These pirates! They are gentlemen who have no right to any consideration, and the captain wanted to win them by kindness. I'll send them some kindness, but in the shape of a good bullet."
"And have they not been seen again?" asked Herbert.
"No, my boy," answered the sailor, "but we shall find them, and when you are cured, we shall see if the cowards who strike us from behind will dare to meet us face to face."
"I am still very weak, my poor Pencroft."
"Well, your strength will return gradually. What's a ball through the chest? Nothing but a joke. I've seen many, and I don't think much of them." At last things appeared to be going on well, and if no complication occurred, Herbert's recovery might be regarded as certain. But what would have been the condition of the colonist if his state had been aggravated? If, for example, the ball had remained in his body, if his arm or his leg had had to be amputated?
"No," said Spilett more than once, "I have never thought of such a contingency without shuddering."
"And yet, if it had been necessary to operate," said Harding one day to him, "you would not have hesitated?"
"No, Cyrus," said Gideon Spilett, "but thank God that we have been spared this complication."
As in so many other conjectures, the colonists had appealed to the logic of that simple good sense of which they had made use so often, and once more, thanks to their general knowledge, it had succeeded. But might not a time come when all their science would be at fault? They were alone on the island. Now men in all states of society are necessary to each other. Cyrus Harding knew this well, and sometimes he asked if some circumstance might not occur which they would be powerless to surmount. It appeared to him besides, that he and his companions, till then so fortunate, had entered into an unlucky period. During the 2 years and a half which had elapsed since their escape from Richmond, it might be said that they had had everything their own way. The island had abundantly supplied them with minerals, vegetables, animals, and as nature had constantly loaded them, their science had known how to take advantage of what she offered them. The well-being of the colony was therefore complete. Moreover, in certain occurrences, an inexplicable influence had come to their aid, but all that could only be for a time. In short, Cyrus Harding believed that fortune had turned against them. In fact, the convict's ship had appeared in the waters of the island, and if the pirates had been, so to speak, miraculously destroyed, 6 of them at least had escaped the catastrophe. They had disembarked on the island, and it was almost impossible to get at the 5 who survived. Ayrton had no doubt been murdered by these wretches, who possessed firearms, and at the first use that they had made of them, Herbert had fallen, wounded almost mortally. Were these the first blows aimed by adverse fortune at the colonists? This was often asked by Harding. This was often repeated by the reporter, and it appeared to him also that the intervention, so strange, yet so efficacious, which till then had served them so well, had now failed them. Had this mysterious being, whatever he was, whose existence could not be denied, abandoned the island? Had he in his turn succumbed? No reply was possible to these questions, but it must not be imagined that because Harding and his companions spoke of these things, they were meant to despair. Far from that. They looked their situation in the face. They analyzed their chances. They prepared themselves for any event. They stood firm and straight before the future, and if adversity was at last to strike them, it would find in them men prepared to struggle against it. End of chapter.